Hello everyone, and welcome. I'm excited to have you here today. Your journey to building websites starts here, and I promise it's going to be an engaging and rewarding experience. Today, we'll explore the fundamentals of the web in just 10 minutes. We'll cover the basics of HTML, the building blocks of any website, and help you get started with creating your own web pages. So, let's dive in and make this a fun and informative session. Today, we're going to explore how easy it is to create and code your very own HTML page in just minutes. We'll start with your very first web page and look at the journey from the server all the way to your browser screen. It's fascinating to understand how websites work behind the scenes. We'll break down the building blocks that make up every website on the internet so you can see how everything connects. You'll often hear about HTML being the foundation of a web page. So, what exactly is HTML? It's the language that tells your browser how to display content, like text, images, and links. Throughout today's session, you'll learn the key concepts of HTML, how to write your own code, and how these pieces come together to build a website. By the end, you'll have a solid understanding of the basics and be ready to create your very first web page. Think of HTML as the skeleton of a website. It defines the structure, giving your web page its shape and layout. When you open a website, HTML is what tells your browser what to display and where to place everything on the page. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and it's the essential foundation that powers every single website you've ever visited. Without it, the pages would just be a jumble of unorganized content. So, understanding HTML is key, because it's the core language that underpins web development and makes websites functional and organized. All right, let's dive into slide 4. So every element you see on a web page is actually defined using HTML tags. Think of these tags as the building blocks that tell the browser how to display content. For example, headings and titles are marked up with specific tags like H1, H2, and so on, which help organize the page and make it easy to read. Then, there are paragraphs of text, which are wrapped in paragraph tags, providing structure and clarity. Images and graphics are inserted using image tags, allowing us to include visual elements that can make the page more engaging. Links to other pages are created with anchor tags, enabling seamless navigation across the website. Lists and navigation menus are built with list tags, helping organize information and guide users through the site efficiently. All of these elements, headings, paragraphs, images, links, lists, are fundamental because they give structure and meaning to the content. They're what we call the building blocks of the web. Without them, a web page would just be a jumble of unorganized information. Understanding these core HTML elements is essential because they form the foundation of any web page we create. It's like learning the basic vocabulary before writing a full story. So, as we move forward, keep in mind that these building blocks are what help us craft clear, accessible, and well-structured web pages. When you open a website, a fascinating process happens behind the scenes that makes everything work smoothly. First, your browser sends a request to the server, asking to access the website you want to visit. This is called the browser request. The server then responds by locating the HTML file that contains the structure and content of the web page and sends it back to your browser, which is known as the server response. Once your browser receives the HTML file, it begins to render and display the content on your screen. This process involves traveling the structure and content to your device, allowing you to see the web page come to life. Understanding this flow helps us appreciate the seamless experience we often take for granted when browsing the internet. Now that we've covered how to create your first HTML file, let's talk about naming it. You should name your file index, HTML. This specific name is important because it signals to your computer that this file is an HTML document. When you save your project, naming it index, HTML ensures that web browsers recognize it as the starting point of your website. Next, remember to save your file as HTML. This step is crucial because saving it with the correct extension allows your code to be interpreted properly by browsers. If you forget to save it as an HTML file, your web page won't display correctly. Once you've named and saved your file, the next step is to start with a blank document. This is where you'll write your HTML code from scratch, giving you full control over your website's structure and content. If you're just getting started, I recommend creating a new file in your code editor, whether that's Notepad on Windows or a more advanced editor like VS Code. Launch your preferred code editor, open a new file, and you're ready to begin coding your first web page. To summarize, naming your file index, HTML, saving it as HTML, starting with a blank document, and using a good code editor are foundational steps that set you up for success in web development. All right, now let's look at the actual code for our first web page. On this slide, I want to highlight some key points. First, you'll notice the structure of an HTML document, starting with the doctype declaration, which tells the browser we're using HTML5. Inside the head section, we set the title of the page, which appears in the Browser tab. Then in the body, we have a heading, Welcome to my website, which is what visitors will see prominently. There's also a paragraph explaining that this is my very first HTML page. I recommend you type this exact code into your editor, so you can see how it all comes together. Remember, understanding this basic structure is fundamental as you start building your own websites. This slide is about connecting the code to the visual result, helping you see how HTML creates the content you see on the page. Keep in mind, the key is to practice writing this code yourself, so you get comfortable with the syntax and the flow. Let's take a closer look at the structure of an HTML document and what each part does. First, we have the paragraph tags, which are used to format regular blocks of text. These are essential for organizing content in a clear, readable way. Then, there are the heading tags, like H1, which create large, bold titles that help structure the page and guide the viewer's eye. Next, everything you see on the page, including text, images, and links, lives inside the body tag. This is your main content area. The head tag, on the other hand, contains information about the page itself, such as its title, meta information, and links to style sheets or scripts. At the very top, you have the HTML tag, which wraps all the content and indicates that this is an HTML document. And importantly, right at the beginning, you include the doctype declaration, which tells the browser that this is an HTML5 document. Understanding these components is fundamental because they form the backbone of any web page. When you connect the dots, it becomes clear how each part plays a role in creating a well-structured, functional web page. All right, now that we've gone through the steps, you've officially created your very first web page with HTML. Congratulations! Celebrate this milestone. It's a big deal. Party popper, the next step is to view your creation in a browser so you can see how it all comes together visually. To do that, you can either double-click the file or simply drag it into your preferred browser, like Chrome, Firefox, or Edge. This will open your web page directly in the browser window. Just remember, before you do that, make sure your file is saved as index.html. That's the standard file name for your main web page. So ensure you've saved your file, and then you're ready to open it in your browser and see your hard work come to life. This is a really exciting moment because it shows your progress from writing code to actually seeing a web page. Keep up the great work. All right, now that we've reached the final slide, let's reflect on what we've accomplished together. We've learned how to experiment with adding more text to our web pages, which is a great way to practice making your site more informative and engaging. Don't forget, you can also try different heading sizes, like H2 and H3, to create visual hierarchy and make your content easier to read. And I encourage you to add a second paragraph. This is a fantastic opportunity to practice organizing your thoughts and making your web page look more complete. Now, looking back at the overall journey, we've started by understanding what HTML is and why it's so important for building websites. Then, we explored how websites work behind the scenes, giving you a solid foundation. We created and saved your very first HTML file, which is a huge milestone. After that, you wrote functional HTML code that actually works. And finally, you viewed your creation in a browser, seeing your hard work come to life. What you've accomplished is really impressive. You've built your very first webpage. Remember, this is just the beginning. The skills you've gained here are the building blocks for creating even more complex and beautiful websites. Keep experimenting, practicing, and most importantly, having fun with your coding journey.